open bar. Um, that was a fun day. Day two is the long day. Lots of plenaries, breakout sessions, daytime. But together, we will get through this. Um, Throughout the past 2 years, we have read numerous stories about this time in our nation's industry and the impact on education. Whether you read the Times, Washington Post, or your local newspaper online, the state of education is a constant, almost dominant theme in our everyday lives, which for many of us we can view as a good thing. Yet, we also know that there are so many stories that go untold, and it is easy to wonder how we as individuals can get our views about specific classrooms or communities to the front of the news desk. Today's lunch discussion is for you, as we have asked my colleague, Dr. Robin Harris, Executive Education Trust Vice President of Communications, to explore how to bring your story to the front of the news cycle. Robin brings more than 15 years of writing, editing, and production experience to the Education Trust. As the leader of our communications team, she is responsible for managing a smooth and efficient production process and helping to ensure that we convey our message in a clear and compelling fashion. I haven't told Robin this, but Robin is one of my favorite colleagues. She's really, really great, very nice, is one of the kindest people I've met. So please welcome Robin and our esteemed panelists to the stage.
So I'm gonna procrastinate a little bit while the long line is getting their food. So we can make sure we maximize our time. But good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Luncheon Plenary. I am excited to be here. Our title is News, 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 How to Be a Part of It. And I'll add how to be a part of it in a good way. We probably should have said that. There are all types of ways to be a part of the news. So I know everybody's been saying how excited they are to be at a boot camp. I am excited too, and not just because we've been virtual for the past 2 years, but because just to be at a boot camp in general. As you all were kind of meeting pre-COVID across the nation several times a year, I was stuck back at the office with our fabulous team of editors and designers, recovering from late nights of making sure all the fact sheets and the reports and the briefs and the publications and all the materials that you got were of a high quality. And it was rewarding to hear staff come back and say how our materials were received, how people were eager to use them, how they might have sparked a conversation. But I will say I am incredibly grateful to be able to experience some of this boot camp magic in person. So I see what you all have been talking about all these years, and glad we're right down the street from the office. So I will say I'm also incredibly grateful for our panelists today. They are quite impressive. They are very busy, so we are extremely appreciative of them spending their lunch hour with us. We know that they have quite a bit to say, so I'm gonna try to not talk and let us learn from them. But you know, a key component of effective advocacy is building awareness. And we depend on the media to do that. They're a key part of our strategy. We depend on folks on the panel to share our research, share our data, to really, you know, create urgency for our cause, to explain exactly why policy matters to people and how it impacts their lives. So that is exactly what our panelists do. They do that by telling us real life stories of students, teachers, classrooms, district leaders. They tell the stories and we depend on them for that. So we're excited to hear from them today. We want to ask them what makes a good news story, what's going to make them open your email, how can we help them get the story right, and how can we be partners in our quest for education equity. So let me introduce our panelists. They can join me on the stage. Give them a round of applause. Hello. You hear me? Great. All right. So joining us today, Evie Blad in the middle is a reporter for Ed Week. As one of the largest trade publications, we really depend heavily on Ed Week. Their readership is like about 1.6 million, I believe. And we depend heavily to know like what's going on around the country. At Education Week, Evie covers a lot of our core equity issues, including federal policy, social emotional learning, and civil rights. Recently, if you look up her byline, she's been doing a lot of writing about unfinished learning, and particularly talking with educators and leaders about challenges they are facing with implementing our evidence-based strategies. Before coming to Ed Week in 2013, she worked at the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, statewide newspaper in Arkansas, so she can bring the perspective from a national trade publication, but also the state and local context. Thank you, Evie. Debbie Trong is a print and audio journalist covering education for WAMU. That's our NPR station. Prior to coming to WAMU, Debbie covered Virginia schools for the Washington Post, where her reporting covered seclusion and restraint in public schools, persistent racial disparities in high-performing school districts, and the fight for more protections for transgender students, so a lot of our core equity issues. Debbie also worked for the Richmond Times District, where she also covered quite a few stories outside of education, the threat of high-speed rail, dilapidated public housing, and work has appeared on Morning Edition, All Things Considered, as well as in the pages of the LA Times, the Buffalo News, the New York Daily News, USA Today, and the Penn Live Patriot News. And finally, Delia Gonzalez is a news reporter at WUSA Today. That's our TV9 station here. She spends a lot of her time talking about the challenges and triumphs of DCPS, of course. She got her first break in the business at the U.S. Senate Radio TV Gallery and at NBC Network News. She then left D.C. to pursue her on-camera reporting endeavors, which took her back to her home of New England. She spent years working at several stations in Massachusetts, so shout out to the Massachusetts crew, and Rhode Island. During that time, she had the privilege of covering, I love this, a number of national stories, including the station nightclub fire in Rhode Island that claimed 100 lives, and also the historic vote on gay marriage in Boston. So we have a group here who have been covering education and news for many years and are excited to talk to you about how you can help them do their jobs better. So let's give them another round of applause. So I have given the textbook bio, but we would like to hear from each of you a little bit more about yourself by way of a story that you covered that's a model for the collaboration that we're trying to create here. Favorite story, model of the collaboration, advocate came, gave you an idea, pitch was great, turned out exactly like you wanted, story accurate, had impact. So, Debbie, you want to start?
Sure. So again, my name is Debbie Trong, and I'm the reporter for our local NPR affiliate here in DC. I don't know if it's my favorite story, but one that sort of comes to mind that I've done in the last year or so. I've worked with an organization called Advocates for Justice in Education here in DC. They teach families how to advocate for themselves. And I was approached with someone who worked with the organization who had talked to a family where a student who thought that they graduated ended up not graduating. And, there are a lot of reasons behind that, but, I did the interview with the family, sort of got a sense of the challenges that the student had encountered. And what it really boiled down to is that, DC, there are a lot of choices where, there are a lot of places where students can go to school, and so in some situations that results in students transferring a lot between campuses, and sometimes when students transfer between campuses, their educational record doesn't always follow, and so there's no centralized body keeping track of classes that a child has taken, what they've taken again, what they need to graduate. And so that was sort of a really wonky thing that I think that if someone approached, it would be difficult and inaccessible in some sort of way, but because this advocate was able to connect me with a family that had gone through the situation, it really sort of humanized it, and I think it made the story make sense to a lot more people.
Sorry, go ahead. So I'm Evie Blood. Did I hear an Arkansas response out there? Woo pig? Woo pig! I'm trying to think, my job functions so much differently since I'm not in local news. You'll talk to people at Ed Week who have like a favorite Margaret Spelling story because they've been there so long. And so the way we work with advocates, you know, I would say is a little more of an ongoing conversation because we cover these issues that come up. You know, I think about when I started at Ed Week was when the Obama administration first released the guidance on racial equity in school discipline, and we've seen how that conversation has gone. One story I wrote last year that wasn't some big, deep investigation, but that covered an issue that we're all familiar with was looking at parents whose children during remote learning, they had sought an initial special education evaluation and still hadn't gotten one. There'd been a lot of focus on the pipeline of folks wanting their students' IEPs adjusted and in the initial parts of the pandemic to make up for how do you do certain kinds of therapies in remote learning? How do you make certain accommodations? But I felt like there wasn't enough focus on the people who, because they were spending time at home with their children and seeing how their children's classmates reacted on screen, maybe were noticing things, learning differences for the first time. And so I worked with advocates in a few states to find parents who might be able to talk to me about their experiences with schools. It wasn't a big thing where, you know, it got good traffic at Ed Week. It wasn't, I don't think it was like the biggest story of the year, but I really like to do the careful work of continuing to discuss these issues, particularly because we write for an audience that's a little more familiar with education in a way to keep moving the conversation forward. So,
like Evie, I will refer back to COVID because COVID changed everything for us, how we cover the news and how we educate our children. And so during the pandemic, while I was home trying to teach my 3 children, I had the opportunity to work with many advocates who really gave us a window into what it was like for parents who were home with their children trying to learn virtually, what it was like for teachers, and the inequities that were happening. A lot of the equipment and the technology that many of our students here in DC still didn't have. And so were it not for those advocates that I teamed up with during the height of the pandemic, I would not have had the opportunity to speak to those people and get their experiences and really elevate their stories, right? And elevating their stories resulted in change, resulted in the DC public schools finally realizing that they needed to make a concerted effort and more of an investment to get technology to the underprivileged or the children who are on the outskirts who are being forgotten. And we were able to follow those families throughout the pandemic. So I hate to go back to the pandemic, and it wasn't one big, massive story like yours, but they are small victories where we get to work with advocates who point us in the right direction, and we can highlight families, stories, people, issues that are important and that eventually lead to change.
3 great stories, and I want to recognize that we didn't just choose any group of reporters. These reporters are specifically writing about the issues that we've been talking about all morning. So I want to ask, following up, a question that everybody kind of has on their mind. And, you know, I want to talk theoretically about the role, but I think the big question that everybody has on their mind, you know, as a reporter who works in radio, TV, print, what do you need from advocates to create a compelling story? Like, what can they go back and kind of get back to their local community and really put into, you know, implementation next week? What do you need?
Well, I'll start with TV because we have very specific needs. We need something visual. We need a character. Oftentimes we're not, in all mediums, we are reaching to a very broad audience. So everyone is not necessarily going to be living in DC and going to have a personal impact on that particular story. So it needs to have a broad impact. Everyone can relate to that issue. So it needs to be timely, it needs to be visual, and it needs to have a character that folks can relate to. A character that you can relate to if you live in, even if you're not a parent, or if you live in the various areas and jurisdictions of our region. That's what we're looking for in a story.
The visual is important there. Yeah.
I took an advertising class in college, and they always used to talk about sell the sizzle, not the steak. So don't call me and say, we have this report coming out. You could say, this data that we have is proving a problem that has been going on for years is suddenly spiking up, and it's affecting kids in this way. Definitely don't call me and say, it's Attendance Awareness Day. That's not a very, what we call a news hook, that's not a very good news hook. If you call me and say, like when I used to cover healthcare, it's Organ Donor Awareness Day, I probably wouldn't cover that. If you call me and say, this woman is meeting the man who got her dad's heart, I would say, well, she would definitely say, well, I want to cover that. So I think another thing that's really important when you're approaching a reporter is to be aware of what they have covered recently about the issue that you're approaching them about. Maybe they haven't at all, but if they have, to kind of understand the context they come from. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, I guess just to add on to that, like I cover education obviously in the DC region and in the city, and sometimes I get pitches from out of state, and you can just sort of tell that it's a mass email to reporters in all parts of the country. So don't do that. I would recommend sending like pitches that you said demonstrate a knowledge of what the reporter has covered in the past. And similar to television, public radio obviously thrives on scenes. One of the, mantras we have is that we want to provide a sense of place. So any sort of stories that transport the listeners to a place, I think is something that we would, bring extra attention to. Also, when you have a story maybe about socio-emotional learning, maybe a report about the importance of a socio-emotional learning isn't exactly spicy or like something that we would cover, but if you have a program that is really sort of demonstrating how to do this well, and you can sort of provide access for a reporter to be there, to talk to people about what's working with the program, to hear from people who are going through the program, that's just a lot more appealing.
So I heard character, place, knowing what the reporter has been writing about, something that can have impact beyond just your individual space, but talk about it at a broad impact. I think these are the things that at Ed Trust we're also trying to think through when we do a report or present the data, like putting a human element on it. So lots of synergy there. It's one thing to hear, I think, what we need to how we can help you all, but we also want to think about this is a relationship. You all talked about your relationship with the advocates, and so just want to generally ask you, how would you describe the relationship between local media and their local community? Each of you, in your own way, are advocates. You care about what you're doing. So I think it also helps us to maybe understand how you think about the role of media in advocacy.
I'll
start. I consider my role as a reporter a public service. I am here to elevate your stories. So I think we work hand in hand. I can't do my job without folks on the ground who know the stories, know the issues. I know I have the privilege of having a platform to raise those issues and bring them to light. And so I think that's my role and how we can work together. I am an advocate. I'm a public servant. I'm an advocate. I'm a mom of DC public school students. I care about this community, and I have a stake in what I cover. Not to say that you need to have all of those, you need to have all of that background in order to be a thoughtful and caring and empathetic reporter, but that is just, that's who I am, and that's how I approach the work that I do. With humility and respect, I understand sharing and telling people's stories is a privilege, and so I'm here to learn. And a lot of what we do is listening. We don't do a lot of talking either. We do a lot of listening and then telling someone else's story.
Yeah, I learn best when I feel safe admitting that I don't know things. And I have to do that a lot as a reporter. I have to do that a lot when I'm speaking to advocates. I know that a lot of you wake up every day very concerned about very specific things that I maybe have never heard of before. In the broader context, I consider the role of a journalist to be helping people draw a map to figure out their way through current events, through life, through whatever situation we're in as a country. I'm not telling you where to go. I'm telling you what to look for to decide where to go. You know, we at least have to have, I mean, in this environment that we're in, people can't even agree on what the truth is, right? So it's my idea to, or it's my mission to present things in as clear and as simple way as possible so that people can process them thoughtfully and reasonably. I'm an auntie to a lot of children and a friend of a lot of educators, and it's hard not to have your personal perspective. That's a good way for advocates to connect with me, I guess is the right way to say it. But I don't consider myself an advocate. I consider myself an amplifier.
I love that, you know, you get different perspectives, so that's important too. Debbie?
Yeah, I guess like to the question about our relationship with the community, I think like being a local reporter definitely adds another layer of obligation to like sort of what you report on. Like that's not to say that you should only write or report on stories that make the community look good. It's more so that, you know, you should approach every story knowing that what you report is going to have real ramifications and consequences for the people that you talk to, people in your community, people that you will likely have to talk with again in the future. And so I think that deserves even more of an added layer of like carefulness and accuracy, and to a certain extent relationship building. You know, I think also an important aspect of this job is to call attention to or to bring a platform or to provide a platform for people who historically have had less access to those platforms or to traditional forms of power and institutions. And so I think it's really important as part of our jobs to be actively seeking those types of stories that, you know, maybe aren't being pushed by people who are the loudest.
You know, I appreciate you all sharing that when you think we use the media with big M and that, the media. And we're really just talking about people that care about their communities, trying to do their best job, so how we can work together. Thank you all for sharing that. We've talked a lot about the pandemic. We've been spending time this morning talking about in schools and classrooms and students in the transition that we all experience with having to go virtual. Curious for you all, how has the pandemic impacted your work? Has it made it hard for you to find stories or sources? And also from, am always curious inside a newsroom, how do decisions get made? But curious, how has the pandemic changed things for you all? Or has it?
It changed everything, right? That's the easy answer. It changed everything, I think, for all of us. But there was a huge learning curve, especially when it came to doing TV at home in my living room and hushing my 3 kids so mommy can go live. Strange looks from neighbors when I was, scrambling with my camera and shooting and doing selfies and going live in my front yard. So there was a lot of that, just technical, logistical things that we had to get over. But it was also, it was a double-edged sword. So the first, it was very difficult because we are so used to being out in the field, meeting folks face to face, building those relationships, and making those connections in person. So that was difficult in the beginning, to try to, how do I get to the root of this story? How do I connect with this person on camera and make it impactful? So when I present that story tonight, someone's gonna feel something or learn something or walk away and read more about this issue in Education Week or something. Then again, it opened up our world. I was able to interview advocates on the West Coast. I was able to have conversations with numerous people in several different locations all at once. So there was a learning curve in building those relationships, but like everyone else throughout the pandemic, we adapted and adjusted to it.
One big concern for us has been access to schools. I don't like how long it's been since I've been in a classroom. Part of it was from Education Weeks, and we stopped travel because the same reason everyone else did. From the school's end, they have an understandable concern, even some still, about letting people into their building. Totally get it. It was for justifiable reasons, but it made it really hard, even when schools were in person, to be able to feel like you could write with authority on certain things that were going on. Also, as a national publication, a lot of times we develop, story framing and stuff by going to a place and meeting people. And I needed a lot more help from advocates to connect me to real people who were really affected by issues, like those parents I talked about previously. I needed to call an advocate in Texas and say, can you help me find a mom who wants her kid to be able to be in a school with masks? Because I couldn't do the things I would normally do to do that. I think the other thing that it did was make it very difficult to know. My family's in Kansas, my extended family, and I went to visit them after I was vaccinated, and I knew it was different there, and I knew folks were handling things different there, but I didn't really know, until I went and experienced how people were processing the pandemic differently, what schools look like there, things like that. It's just, as much as you think that you get it, you don't until you, and so it was like we were all experiencing something very differently, and I was sitting in my apartment trying to tell you that, which is a really difficult thing.
Yeah, I guess from like a practical standpoint, because public radio relies so much on, being somewhere with somebody and hearing them, we just simply could not do that in the first year and a half of the pandemic. So that was really difficult. I think the pandemic in some ways definitely made things more accessible to folks, school board meetings that would typically happen 5 p.m. on a Wednesday night, and only some families could get to. Now they could log on virtually and they could sort of testify and express what was on their mind. So I think in that sort of way, that was positive. I guess the other side of that is that because we were so constrained and not able to really go out into the communities that we cover in the way that we normally would, we relied a lot on social media and who was able to show up to the school board meetings and testify virtually. And, you know, I know that that's just sort of like a fraction of who I would ideally like to be covering. You know, there are people that don't have access to the internet, the computer, they're on. And so I think the question of how to find those people when we're like so constrained is something that I still think about a lot and don't really have a clear answer to.
Can I just add on, Robin? Because I want to add on to what Evie said too, and the fact that we didn't have access to go into the schools and everything was virtual. We had to rely on whatever the officials were telling us because we weren't there and we couldn't fact check them in real life. So I think back to the beginning of the pandemic when the mayor and the city council and the school chancellor, and there were so many issues regarding school safety at the time, were conducting their news conferences virtually, and reporters could only call in their questions. And I remember being so heated because they didn't let me get my second question in, and they moved on to the next person. And we just had to take whatever they gave us. That was challenging because it was their message and their spin. And it took some time, and it took the work of advocates, of brave teachers who were in the school buildings, who could send us cell phone video of what they saw, of parents who were willing to speak up to really change that narrative for us.
And one more thing too, sorry. Just more from a coverage perspective, we've seen a surge in interest in more practical district level, school level stories and away from the policy stories. Now, that doesn't mean policy isn't important to people, but we know that people are interacting with, engaged with local education, governance in a way that, I mean, I remember I'd be in Arkansas in a school board meeting and there'd be like me and two people there. And now, you know, for better or worse, in some cases, people are really engaged. And so it doesn't mean that we're not talking about policy, but it does mean that when we talk about policy, we're trying to be really mindful of the student level and classroom level impact. And I think that that shift has been really intensified by the pandemic.
Question we talked about earlier, and I'm hearing some of this in what you're saying, the way things changed, but what will you keep? So it sounds like, you know, the access to maybe advocates on the West Coast, is that gonna stay? Like, what are you gonna keep in your, what you've learned over the past 2 years, and what are you gonna keep in the way you do your jobs? Just curious, something gonna stay? That wasn't on the list,
I think it has expanded, especially for local TV, working for a company who doesn't even want you to drive to Baltimore on a weekly basis, right? We're hyper local, we want to stay within our jurisdiction, and we have a deadline. I have to get on the air at 5 o'clock, no matter what. And so Otter helped me a lot, where I could now transcribe all my interviews. Zoom, I can bang out a Zoom interview in 15 minutes and line up numerous people. When I was physically driving from location to location, that was very hard to pull off. So in many ways, it has given us access and opened us up, and so I will, and we still do implement a lot of Zooms in our coverage. I just interviewed Ben Crump for a story that's airing tonight, and he was in a hotel room, some random location, because he moves around constantly. That would not be available had it not been for the pandemic.
I think I want to retain a certain level of humility. That feeling of getting off the plane in Kansas and saying, I knew things were different, but to feel it is, I think, something that I should have been more mindful of before, and should be more mindful of in the future, that that there are experiences and perspectives that I don't understand, or that I think I understand, that affect people in a much more personal or emotional way than I have acknowledged.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I and like my station has tried to do is really sort of talk about the ways in which the pandemic have like concretely affected people and keeping people at the forefront of our coverage. And so I think during the pandemic, we just, doubled down on that and made that more of an intense focus and found new ways to, I guess, amplify some of the voices that we were looking for, and like found creative ways to bring those voices in. Like when I couldn't, go in person and interview students, I had students like record voice memos over the course of a week about how they were feeling and sort of stitch that together into like an audio narrative of 4 minutes. And I think if, had the pandemic not happened, I don't know that I would think to tell that story in that sort of way and let the student voices stand for themselves.
No, that's good. And I think, as advocates are thinking about what will interest a reporter, you've got a student willing to kind of record themselves or follow them, just little tactics like that seem helpful. So one burning question was, yes, what can we do? The other burning question is really about what's happening in education coverage right now. So I think Evie might have mentioned it's hard to know what the truth is. So, or people kind of, there's all this debate over the truth. So want to just, the big issue and debate around critical race theory, not necessarily happening in the DC space yet, probably. Would love to hear you all talk about the kind of role of media in discussing the importance of teaching all aspects of history.
Gosh, it's so tough because you don't want to amplify things that are just there to make people mad, right? You don't want to amplify disingenuous things, but you also want to call things disingenuous when they are. You want to tell the truth about what this word actually means and the extent to which these concerns are real or imagined, or people are trafficking in people's fears. It's really hard to know what the right way to cover that is sometimes. Do we write something to fact check XYZ? Is that helping the situation by making it more clear? Is it harming the situation by drawing attention to something that was designed to gain attention? That's a really tough question that is happening in newsrooms all the time. At the same time, acknowledging that there are parents who have concerns about how topics like gender are discussed in schools. Well, what is a reasonable way to have that discussion? And what would it look like to handle that thoughtfully? But the noise, the heat, and the lack of light has been so difficult. And I know that anyone in this room could look at us and say, well, that's on you guys. It is a really hard thing to know how to handle. And I don't know,
newsrooms, there are a lot of difficult discussions happening in newsrooms around critical race theory and around so many other issues that are social justice and civil rights issues happening in our country right now. And I think really, one, it's approaching it knowing that you don't know all the answers and that you're kind of a student yourself, but doing our due diligence and not putting something on the air or in broadcast or in print that hasn't been vetted, hasn't been looked at, hasn't been reviewed by numerous people. So while you see the 3 reporters here, we don't act as individuals. Our name may be on the story, in the byline, but there's a whole team of folks in the newsroom who kind of are weighing all of that, because we do know that we have this responsibility to not only get it right, but to be fair, and to not spark any kind of controversy, additional controversy.
Sorry, just one thing. I want to recommend a recent report by my colleague Stephen Sawchuk, who went around the country and looked at ways that states were revising their social studies standards. And he went in and found individual words that people were changing after these meetings and hearings to illustrate this. And I think that is the kind of coverage we need. Not, I'm afraid, not speaking in big glossy terms, honestly, from either side. We need specific ways that this is affecting what's actually happening in classrooms, as a way of showing what this conversation actually means for a student.
Yeah, I think on that note, I think like media, journalists in general, need to be like really mindful of who we're giving a platform to, who's sort of who we are allowing to dominate the discussion and discourse on things like quote unquote critical race theory. I mean, and who they represent within a community. I think one sort of, there are reporters that have done this, but I think one undercovered aspect of the discussion of how systemic racism is taught in schools is the voices of like students of color who are watching like this sort of debate play out and likely internalizing a lot of what's happening around them and sort of feeling a certain way about their histories, their lived experiences being discredited and invalidated. And I think, like as reporters, we could do a better job of sort of trying to bring out those stories, or getting into a classroom where an educator is talking about these sort of issues in a thoughtful way that is providing a lot of value to a child's education and what that sort of looks like, instead of sort of maybe disproportionately giving a lot of attention to, people who are making, bad faith attacks or are being disingenuous.
There's a great series, if you go, the Dallas Morning News tweeted out this morning of reporters around the country talking to students from various marginalized groups about how the current political moment is affecting them, and LGBTQ students in Oklahoma and students of color in Texas. And yeah, I would recommend.
I have got my burning questions answered. We could continue to talk about them. I think a lot of what you all said resonates a lot with the struggles that we're having in not having culture wars take over or take up our space or affect our messaging. So I appreciate that. But I want to open it up to the audience for questions. Some of you have stopped me in the hall and said, I'm excited about this. I really want to know this. So this is the opportunity to, get some insight into what makes something news and how it reaches a story. Any questions? I should have let them know we were switching to audience Q&A. All right, well, you can use my mic. Here you go.
At Ed Trust, we're here to serve.
I appreciate that. I probably could have spoke without it anyway. So I love this conversation, particularly because I'm raising 3 young people at home who really use social media more so as their information source. And we have really good, rigorous conversations. I tend to tune into television, news stations, and, some online newsletters that that I follow. But I'm curious to hear about your thoughts when you're starting to talk about being a journalist and being, the importance of fact checking. I actually went to school for journalism. and the meeting of where young people are today in terms of their sources of information, and your thoughts around not just accuracy, but the importance of them being informed, and how you see that changing in meeting, again, like meeting young people where they are. That's to anyone.
There are some, do you guys follow the Washington Post TikTok? Do you guys know what I'm talking about? When this guy first started making these TikToks, I was like, what is your deal? Like, how is this a good idea? And now they have 3 people on their TikTok team. There are these efforts to make news literacy real for kids and meet them where they're at instead of pretending like they're gonna wake up and read a print newspaper with a cup of black coffee in a fedora. And there are some, great efforts by groups like Pointer and stuff to talk to kids about how to verify information. And there are like ambassadors in the news media who are a part of that work. I don't think it's a problem that has been solved. There's all of this, misinformation passes very quickly on places like TikTok because it feels so immediate and so personal. But true, impactful information also passes quickly on places like TikTok. Think about like the women's NCAA tournament last year when the basketball player from Oregon tweeted out like, this is what the men's weight room looks like and this is what ours, like things changed fast because of that. And so I think figuring out how to harness that immediacy is really, I think you're going to see more news organizations trying to adapt to those formats.
Yeah, social media has changed journalism in so many ways, for better or for worse. I'm still trying to decide. But speaking of TikTok, we ourselves at WUSA 9 have our own TikTok as well, and we have something that we've launched, a brand called Verify, and it is all about getting down to the facts. It's what we've always done. It's what reporters have always done. We've always fact-checked things. But now it's putting it in a clear, concise way so folks, so we can get to the truth and folks can see the work that we've done and the experts that we've spoken to. So our Verify team is on TikTok, is on Instagram, with quick snippets saying, hey, we've seen this viral post, let's break it down, and this is what it really means. So that has really changed the way that we communicate with folks. The way folks consume news, and I know I'm a NPR listener and a news watcher, and my kids are on social media as well. So we're trying to strike that balance, and I think where you can slowly see it throughout the industry with small TikToks and small accounts, and I think you'll probably just see more in the future.
Yeah, just to echo all of that, I think media literacy, like how to teach media literacy, is a thing that a lot of folks are trying to work through now, and I know that there are some nonprofit organizations that have worked in schools to teach media literacy, but when it comes to sort of making news accessible to young people, again, I think it's just sort of meeting them where they are. WAMU's online news website, DCist, and also the NPR main Instagram account, I think are really good at finding a lot of young users. They're often very graphic, image-heavy posts that you can find the story through a link. And so I don't know, just sort of developing those ways to engage young people is really important.
I saw some other hands. My question is, one, thank you all for being here. I think there's much for us to learn in advocacy in terms of messaging from you all as journalists. My question is, what advice would you give? My organization in particular, we've gone back and forth on trying to build out equity style guides and thinking about different messaging, and to switch from how do you reach young people to switch to how do you reach Texas legislators, which is what we're trying to do all the time. is a jump, right? And so I'm always in this place of cognitive dissonance around how I engage and message things to stakeholders on the ground versus legislators, and I would love some advice from you guys, because I feel like journalists are doing that all the time as well.
A story could do both. By answering who is this affecting and how do I change this? And so I think being very clear about what policies need to change in speaking with reporters. This might feel really elementary, and I'm sorry, I don't. Saying, you know, there's this bill that's been filed 6 years in a row and it never makes it out of committee. I wouldn't lead with that on your conversation with the reporter. I would lead with, kids are on the bus for 2 hours because there's inadequate transport in the state's school funding formula. And then I would say, here's a bill that would address that. And, you know, being able to acknowledge those two elements of newsworthiness in the same time, and making sure that whatever journalist you're communicating with is aware of the policy levers that are involved in the situation, to make sure that, you know, if a TV journalist is getting this visual of a kid on the bus for 2 hours, that they also have the 3 bullet points at the end. This is the bill that people are trying to promote. I think you also have to be able to acknowledge thoughtfully what your opponents would say about what you're trying to do. That doesn't mean you're speaking for them, but reporters appreciate it when you acknowledge the complexity of a conversation. This is why it hasn't made it out of committee. And it might be that there's some influential lobbyist or something that doesn't want it to. It may be that, oh, there's some technical thing that needs to be fixed, but you do better when you acknowledge that on the front end, if that's helpful at all.
I heard character, place again, regardless of who you're trying to reach. Those are things that are human, and I think whatever story, adding that to. We have time for one more question.
Hi, thank you so much for being here. My name is Sierra Hart, and I wanted to know, you talked a little bit about what it would take to get access to a news story, but currently, what are some perspectives and stories that you would like to hear from, aside from like the CRT debates, that maybe folks in this room could like give you to contribute to, and what would be the best method and ways to get those stories to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like, you know, this is maybe not surprising, but I imagine that I'll be spending the rest of this year, probably longer, talking about the consequences of the pandemic on students in all its forms. So the mental health aspect, how that's showing up in schools, what advocates are hearing, what can be done to address some of the trauma that students have gone through, and how that is affecting learning, and also obviously the academic consequences. What does this mean for, you know, the entirety of a child's educational experience? How long will, you know, what they went through during virtual learning stay with them? So I guess any sort of stories that can help bring that to the surface, I think would be really valuable.
Yeah, the mental health aspect in our schools is of major concern, not only for me as a parent, but as a reporter. We are often covering these massive fights and weapons being brought into schools and police. Those incidents are definitely rising. We don't have any hard numbers yet. So, you know, I'm really looking for a story from an advocate that can bring me on the inside and not only talk about the problem, but the good work that I know is being done by some of the social workers and the folks in school who are talking to our kids. And then I also know that teachers are burned out and will be leaving if they haven't already. And so that's going to have dire consequences. And we'll see that play out next school year. So I'd love to get ahead of that and talk to a teacher in regards to, what can the system do to keep you, to right this wrong, to kind of save your career and to save the future of these kids who are going to be impacted by you leaving. That's just a couple. But yeah, it's how has the pandemic changed everything in the future, and how are we going to get this ship straightened out? How are we going to adjust afterwards?
I've talked too much, so I'll be really fast.
Oh, sorry. There's some mumbling back there. What's happening? Did someone? Oh, ship with the P.
Ship.
But y'all can just interpret that any way you want.
I mean, it would work either way.
I'm off the record, by the way.
So really quickly, how schools should be spending their relief money, if they're doing it right, how they should change course. Are there things that schools have tried that you all want them to adapt to? Transparency about that. If there's something that's working well in your state that would work, you think people in other states could learn from, I would love to hear that. Unintended consequences of federal laws that are supposed to help, but XYZ hurt. And then I think the last thing would be apparently very important because I can't remember. Oh, any changes that happened to policy during the pandemic that you want to keep? I know lunch waivers are a big one. There are certain waivers to Medicaid that have been making school telehealth easier. I love to hear about stuff like that. My email address is eblad@educationweek.org. I get hundreds of emails a day, but if you email me, I'll try to read it. And I'd love to hear from any of you.
Great. Thank you all so much. And you also said if you email and you don't hear back in a week, you can also send it again, and it'll pop to the top of their
Keep
inbox.
going.
I learned that tip earlier. So I really appreciate you all spending your lunch hours with us. I know you're busy. This has been a fantastic conversation. I want to thank you in the audience for your questions, and I also want to thank the fabulous communications team at Ed Trust, specifically Joe Wheaton and Nicole Grayson. Joe did an awesome job bringing our panelists today, so definitely wanted to acknowledge him for that. I think that we are moving on. Thank you.